Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Ayin Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Zev Siegel, Chaya Sar Nisan, and Nomi Noy in loving memory of Rabbi Shmuel Halevi Segal. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Avrik and Jose Rosenfeld in loving memory of Sarah's brother, Moshe David ben Naftali Yosef Halevi Vilea Shehe'emid Talmidim Harbe. Okay, we're going to get started. We have a very fun daf because it's incredibly short Amud Aleph, okay? As we said yesterday, 9 words in Amud Aleph. So we will get very quickly through it. You might say, oh, this means it's complicated. It's complicated, but more if you're doing a shiur of iyun, because there's a whole debate about some side issue, which we're not going to, some commentary of Rashi that caused a whole ruckus about Tuma and all sorts of things that are not really germane to the daf, so we're not going to get into that. Anyone who wants to can look into it, can read that really long Tosfot on the page. B'hatzlacha. We're going to get started with a review, though, of where we got to, because in order to understand today's daf, we have to remember all the things we did yesterday. So we started in the middle of Ayin Vav Amud Aleph with trying to figure out what Rabbi Shimon in the Mishna was talking about when he said there's a difference between sanctified items that you're liable for, that you're responsible for, that you'll be liable if somebody steals it and sells it or slaughters it, versus a case where you're not responsible for it. You said, I'll bring this animal, and then someone steals the animal. Well, you don't have to replace it, so you won't be obligated. To which we said it doesn't really make sense that it's referring to the previous case in the Mishnah about someone who stole and then sanctified. It must be talking about a case where someone first sanctified, meaning the owner sanctified the animal when it was still in their domain, and then came a thief and stole it. So basically, we're talking about stolen sacrifices. And then that's what Rabbi Shimon said, depending on what type of, how the animal was sanctified by the original owner will affect whether the thief will be liable the 4 or 5 payment. To which we said, but wait, that doesn't fit. And today we're going to do a lot of, he said this, and if he said that somewhere else, and how does it all work in? Or maybe we're going to use it as saying, oh, that fits perfectly with something they said somewhere else. But in this case, we start off with a question. How can Rabbi Shimon say that? Because if Ruth stole a sacrifice from Naomi, that Naomi had made a sacrifice already, and Ruth goes and slaughters it, well, where did Ruth slaughter it? We're assuming she slaughtered it outside the temple, because why would we think she did it in the temple? If she slaughters it outside the temple, that is a shlita she'ena reuya. That is not a proper shlita. And if it's not a proper shlita, then basically we're going to have a problem. Because if it's not a proper shlita, again, this all fits in with what Rabbi Shimon himself holds. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with the rabbis about this, but holds that a shchita she'ena ru'ya, if it's not a shchita that's going to allow you to eat it, and if you slaughter a sacrifice outside the temple, you can't eat it, can't benefit from it at all. That's not called shchita, which means if it's not called shchita, then you're not liable for slaughtering it, right? There's no liability for tvicha. That's Rabbi Shimon's whole approach. You don't get punished for the 4 or 5 payment if you slaughtered an animal, let's say a non-kosher animal. You won't be liable. So how does this work? To answer that question, we brought 3 answers. 2 in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, 1 in the name of Reish Lakish. The gist of the Rabbi Yochanan ones was it actually was slaughtered in the temple, and it was a pure animal that could be slaughtered in the temple, unblemished meaning, and either it was slaughtered for Naomi, the original owner, or it was slaughtered for Ruth, the current owner. Those were the 2 possibilities. If it was for Naomi, the blood was spilled by accident. Otherwise, it would have actually replaced the animal for Naomi. So you have to say the blood got spilled and the sacrifice never went through fully. Or Ruth did it for herself. According to Reish Lakish, no, it can't be talking about that. And we're going to get today to why did each one not hold by the other? But according to Reish Lakish, it must be it had a blemish, and it had a blemish, and that's why we could sacrifice it. We could, it could be slaughtered because you can slaughter that outside the temple. Now, you can slaughter it outside the temple, assuming you redeemed it. Okay, so now we're going to get to the big question of, well, according to Reish Lakish, it wasn't redeemed. So you actually really can't sell it, slaughter it outside the temple because it wasn't yet redeemed. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, if the blood was spilled, well, then that's also not, in other words, each time, if you didn't redeem it, well, then it's not a kosher shechita because you could. If the blood was spilled in the temple, then the shechita turns out wasn't really a kosher shechita. So how do we resolve that? We resolve that very simply by saying that there's this concept that Reish Lakish himself says elsewhere. I'm sorry, that Rabbi Shimon himself says elsewhere. Again, this is why I said we're going to combine all sorts of statements of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says elsewhere that anytime the blood could have been spilled, but poured on the altar, but wasn't, or I didn't mean spilled, I meant sprinkled or poured, or the animal could have been redeemed, it's as if it was already done. And therefore, the shechita is called a kosher shechita, even though it wasn't really. But it's enough to consider it a kosher shechita because when the shechita was done, it could have, right? It could have been done. The animal could have been redeemed first. It could have been, the blood could have been spilled after. That makes it a kosher shechita, even though it wasn't really a kosher shechita, but there was potential to have had it. Where we get this from? Well, the zrika and also the redeeming, which we haven't seen yet inside, but we did see this sprinkling, all comes from topics of when is something considered food that's susceptible to impurity. In order for food to be susceptible to impurity, it has to be called food. It has to be edible. In order to be edible, again, an opinion of Rabbi Shimon that not everyone agrees with, but Rabbi Shimon says it has to be edible halachically also, not just edible physically, but also you have to be able to halachically eat it. So now we're going to talk about, right, the first was zrika, that if there's meat, notar, leftover meat, that even though right now it can't be eaten, and it couldn't have been eaten before because it couldn't have actually been eaten because the blood was never sprinkled. But if the blood could have been sprinkled, there was enough time during the day to sprinkle the blood, then that's considered enough to be called edible to say it's susceptible to impurity. That was a long review. We had some time, so I thought it was good to review. And also it's very important for today's daf, not just for the sake of reviewing. Now we're going to start from the bottom of Ayin Vav Amud Bet inside. Anything that could have been potentially redeemed is viewed as if it's redeemed. Did Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, you ready for all of Amud Aleph in one sentence? Para mitamei tumat ochlin ho'il v'haitala shat hakosher. A para aduma, you don't eat the para aduma. What do? You burn it. Now, it can be the meat of a para aduma animal can be mitame tumat ochlin. Also is considered food for the purposes of if, let's say, a sheretz gets on it, a creepy crawly creature, it can make the meat impure because it had a shat hakosher, because it could have been at some point eaten. What do you mean it could have been eaten at some point? What are we talking about? So for that, we turn to Amud Bet. Reish Lakish, Omer haya Rabbi Shimon, again, connecting with another statement of Rabbi Shimon, para nifdet al gabei marachta. Rabbi Shimon held that you could redeem a para aduma while it was on the pyre, okay, while it was going to be burned. If you find a better, nicer para aduma and you decide, you know what, I'm going to use a different para aduma, you're actually allowed to redeem it, okay? Para aduma is different from other sacrifices. There's a good example. So it can be redeemed. Okay, what's the whole debate about on Amud Aleph that we have this long Tosfot? So it's a bit of a question because if we're talking about tumat ochlin, a para aduma meat in general is mitame as an avatuma, not even a tumat ochlin. It's a much more severe type of tuma, and that's a whole question that the commentaries discuss what exactly we're talking about here, because it's way worse than ochlin. It's the whole para makes, if you remember, the person who deals with it becomes tamei and all that. It's an avatuma itself. Anyway, the whole debate about that, we're not getting into that right now. But why is it not Tmura? Because this isn't a sacrifice. A para aduma is not a sacrifice, so there is no din of Tmura. Tmura is when you designate an animal for a sacrifice. There's no law of Tmura for the para aduma. That seems clear here. So now, that's our halacha. So we're done. Okay, that was it. That was the main, that was the proof for kol omed lifadot kipadoidam. So now what we've done is, we answered the question that Rabbi Elazar asked at the top of Ayin Vav Amud Aleph against Rabbi Yochanan and against Reish Lakish, right? Shchita materet, what do you mean? Isn't it zrika? And then the shchita is not kshera. And shchita materet, what about padiyah? You have to redeem it. Well, no, in the end, we're going to say because this could have been redeemed, the blood could have been sprinkled, even if it wasn't, it's as if it was done. And that we learned. So basically, if you want to say it like this, you could say there's at least two ramifications to this principle of kol omed lizrok, one is for tumat ochlin, and the other is it a shchita kshera? Is it considered a kosher shchita, even if the animal in the end can't be eaten, right? And for the purposes of, if you did it, if you stole the animal and slaughtered it, would you be liable? Okay, so this proves why you would be. Now we're going to go back to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and say the following. Bishlama, okay, what's a bishlama structure? We have a little time, so we could talk about some other things. Bishlama structure always works in the following way. We've gone over this before, but it's always good to review. Bishlama is something makes sense. Shalem is complete. Something is complete and makes perfect sense. Something that we saw doesn't make complete sense. And then we have to figure out, and then they raise, what's the issue with the second item? It could be, by the way, this and this and this and this makes sense, but one part doesn't. It's usually always a question on one thing, but referring back to some list or some two opinions. In our case, it's the two opinions. And then it explains why it doesn't make so much sense. And then it explains how it does make sense. So Bishlama Rabbi Yochanan lo amar ka Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. It's very easy to figure out why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold by Reish Lakish. Because he preferred to explain our Mishna if we were talking about sanctified items. Much better when you're talking about sanctified items to talk about sanctified items that can go on the altar, that are kosher, that are complete, that don't have blemishes to them. You'd rather not explain when we're talking about sanctified items that we're talking about blemished sanctified items. Reish Lakish, my time alone, Rabbi Yochanan, but it's more difficult to figure out why Reish Lakish was pushed into a corner basically to have to say it was blemished animals. Why didn't he just agree with Rabbi Yochanan? Here are some possibilities if the animal was a tmima, but had some issue, but or was slaughtered for Naomi or was slaughtered for Ruth. Like, what's wrong with that? Amalach, he could say to you, and in fact, not only is the Gemara suggesting this, but the Gemara is going to prove this because there's actually a machloket about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about this exact issue. This is what I said, that today we're combining all sorts of things, sometimes bringing something someone said and said, well, it contradicts. That's how we started with the Rabbi Shimon. Contradicts it seemed to contradict what he said about Shchita She'ena Ru'ya. Then we connected it with other statements that Rabbi Shimon did say. But now we're going to say that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, which is Reish Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan have a machloket about some other issue, and that connects with this and explains why Reish Lakish couldn't hold like Rabbi Yochanan. So what's their machloket? He could say, utfacho o mecharo. This is our pasuk we keep quoting, and we've already seen some things that we've learned from the juxtaposition of the words tvicha and mechira to each other, slaughtered or sold. Kol hecha de'ite b'mechira, ite b'tvicha. If you have a particular animal that can be sold, then, and you sell it, you'll be liable 4 or 5. And then that same animal, you'll be liable for slaughtering it. But okay, that's pretty obvious. But here comes the issue. If it's an animal that can't be sold, then if you slaughter it, you won't be liable 4 or 5. In other words, if you can't be liable for selling it, the 4 or 5 payment, then you won't be liable for slaughtering it, the 4 or 5 payment. Why not? So, like, why here do we have something that can't be sold? Let's see an example. I have 2 examples for this principle in both directions, and it's going to go both ways. If you can't slaughter it, then you won't be liable for selling it. If you can't sell it, you won't be liable for slaughtering it. So, Hani Kodshim, if you say we're talking about, and this is Reish Lakish's approach, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He doesn't think the 2 are connected. He thinks you could have an animal that can't be sold, but it can be slaughtered, and therefore you'll be liable, the 4 or 5 for slaughtering. But comes Reish Lakish and he says, no, you won't be. And these kodshim, if you have animals that are designated for the altar, and they're kosher, they're unblemished animals, you can slaughter them on the altar, and you sell it, right? So let's say Ruth stole Naomi's animal that was already designated as a sacrifice, and she brings it, she instead of bringing it to the temple and slaughtering it, she sells it, right? Our case is she brings it to the temple and slaughters it. But let's say she tries to sell it to someone. Now, it's not hers to sell because, well, besides she stole it, but you could sell something you stole, but it belongs to the temple. You can't sell something, right? It's not owned by anyone. So, Hani Kodshim, it's not a sale because it's not hers to sell. It belongs to the temple. So, since that's not a sale, and therefore, if she sold it, since it's not a valid sale, she actually won't be obligated 4 or 5 because she didn't do anything. It wasn't a valid sale. So since that's the case, if she slaughters that same animal, no can do. You can't sell sacrifices. But what can you do? The only time you can sell sacrifices is if it is blemished. If it's blemished, then right? That's the whole thing always. When we have a sacrifice, and you leave it till it gets a blemish, like if something happens, let's say the owner, right, it's a chatat, a sin offering, and the owner, well, that's a little different. You can't actually redeem that one. But let's say it's there's certain ones that you can actually redeem if something happens to it. You wait till it gets a blemish, you redeem, then you redeem it, put on money, right? And then the animal's free to do with what you want with it. So here we're going to say very simply, that's why Reish Lakish had to say it was a Baal Mum. Because if it wasn't a blemished animal, you wouldn't be able to sell it. And if you can't sell it, then you won't be liable for slaughtering it. And that's why he can't agree with Rabbi Yochanan. And now the Gemara tells us, Azdu l'ta'amayu. Azdu l'ta'amayu means we're going to say these people, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, that we're discussing, are consistent with a machloket they have somewhere else. And here we're going to see a perfect itmar structure. We talked about itmar the other day. The itmar has a very unique structure, and it's an introduction to machloket and mora'im. And the last time we saw it, it was missing a part. This time it has that part, okay? And I'll point it out right now. The itmar. We're going to have title, what the topic of the machloket is. Then we're going to have he said this and he said that. And then we're going to say, this is the part that was missing last time, he says this because of that, and he said that because of that. So, if you sell a treifa, that's an animal that's going to die, meaning if you slaughter it, it's not kosher. Now, here we're not talking about slaughtering it, we're talking about selling it. Now, you have to go, and this is, again, we're going to combine a whole bunch of things. Lidivrei Rabbi Shimon. Okay, this would only be according to Rabbi Shimon. Remember Rabbi Shimon's unique approach. He says, if you slaughter an animal that's a treifa, or not a kosher shlita, right, like slaughtering a treifa, then you're not liable for tvicha, right? You're not liable for slaughtering. The rabbis disagree with this point. Okay, just remember that. The rabbis think you slaughtered. What's the difference if the animal could be eaten or can't be eaten? It doesn't matter. But Rabbi Shimon says, shlita she'ena ruya lo shma shlita. A shlita that can't be eaten, right? It's not a valid shlita, is not called shlita. You're not, and therefore, if you steal and slaughter that kind of animal, you're not going to be liable. So the perfect example is a treifa. If you slaughter a treifa, you won't be liable. So now let's take Reish Lakish's approach. Reish Lakish says, well, if you slaughter it, you won't be liable. Then if you sell a treifa, you won't be liable either. And that's exactly what we're going to see here. So again, this is only according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds that if you slaughter this animal, you won't be liable. Once we establish that, Rabbi Yochanan Amal Chayav, you're liable for selling it because one is not connected with the other. Reish Lakish Amal Patul. Reish Lakish says you're exempt. Now here comes the structure. So first we had what each one holds, and now we're going to have the description, which you already know. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav. Why? Af agav delete b'tvicha, even though you won't be liable for slaughtering that kind of animal, ite b'mechira, but yeah, you will be liable for selling it. What does one have to do with the other? Reish Lakish Amar Patul. Reish Lakish exempts you. Kevan delete b'tvicha, lete b'mechira. Because you're not liable for slaughtering, you're not liable for selling. Because that's what he holds. Hekesh. We make a juxtaposition, and we learn from the juxtaposition that halacha, that it has to be an animal that if you had sold it, it would be a sale, and you'd be liable, then also for the slaughtering, and the reverse. If you'd be liable for the slaughtering, then you'll be liable for selling it. But if you're not liable for the slaughtering because it's a treifa, then you won't be liable for selling it. Again, only according to Rabbi Shimon, who thinks that slaughtering this kind of animal, you won't be liable. So now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So again, what have we established so far? We've established, and how did we get here? We said, why did Rabbi Yochanan not hold like Reish Lakish? Why did Reish Lakish not hold like Rabbi Yochanan? And we answered the part about why did Reish Lakish not hold by Rabbi Yochanan? Right? Rabbi Yochanan didn't hold by Reish Lakish because he preferred to say it was an unblemished animal. So that sounds good. Why didn't Reish Lakish say that? Because there was no way to establish the case with an unblemished animal, because an unblemished animal can't be sold. And if it can't be sold, then you're not liable for selling it. And if you're not liable for selling it, then you won't be liable for slaughtering it, because those two go hand in hand. And that's why this slaughtering case couldn't have been, right? That's why he didn't understand it as slaughtering unblemished animals, and it would have to be blemished. So now we established that there's a machloka between the two of them on this exact topic. Do we learn something from the juxtaposition of the cases to our issue or not? Now, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan raises a question against Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is Reish Lakish. He raises a question against him from a braita. Two cases in this braita. Notice the way it goes. Ganav kilaim utvacha, treifa umechara. So we have one case where you're slaughtering an animal, one case where you're selling an animal. Notice it doesn't say, most of our Mishnayot or braita, we've been seeing tavachu machal, right? One or the other. In this case, it specifically puts slaughtering with the kilaim animal, which we'll talk about in a minute, and selling with the treifa animal. And it says, you're mishalem tashlumei Bava Kamma. You pay the 4 or 5 payment. Now, the treifa umechara is exactly the case that there's a machlokah between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. But remember, their machlokah is only according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds the shchita she'eina ruya lo shma shchita, right? So let's hold off on that for 1 minute. Let's go to the kilaim for a minute and explain what this is. If you steal an animal that's a crossbreed between, let's say, a sheep and a goat, if you steal that kind of animal and you slaughter it, you'll be liable 4 or 5 payment. Okay, we don't know what they're trying to say here yet. Okay, and why specifically only tvicha, not mechira? We don't really know. But treifa mechara, we know exactly why they said only mechara, because only if you sell the treifa, not if you slaughter it, you'll be liable, right? You won't be liable if you slaughter it. Now, why wouldn't you be liable if you slaughter it? Only if you hold by Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is the one who said a treifa that you slaughter is not considered slaughtering. The rabbis think it is. So this fits perfectly with Rabbi Yochanan, because you can assume the braita is Rabbi Shimon. So that's what we're going to read right now. My lav Rabbi Shimon, is this not Rabbi Shimon, who basically is going to say, only if you sell a treifa will you be liable? This is, by the way, talking about what it doesn't say in the braita. The braita says if you take a treifa and you sell it, you're liable 4 or 5, which seems to imply that if you take a treifa and you slaughter it, not sell it, you won't be liable. So, Alma, what do you see here? Now, here comes Rabbi Yochanan's proof, very clear. Since you can't slaughter it, according to Reish Lakish, you also wouldn't be liable for selling it. But here it says you're liable for selling it. So here that proves my point. Now, his point is only going to be valid if the braita really is Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Because if it's not Rabbi Shimon's opinion, then you'll also be liable for slaughtering, and then it's irrelevant to the discussion. So that's, of course, what Rabbi Reish Lakish is going to try to explain. Amar le, Reish Lakish said back to him, lo, Rabbanan. No, I'll explain to you that this is talking about the rabbi's approach. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say to him, makes no sense. This is the rabbi's approach. Well, why did it only say selling? What is there? You're not going to be liable for slaughtering a treifa, according to the rabbis. A slaughtering that's not a kosher slaughter doesn't matter. You still did the act of slaughtering. You'll be liable for slaughtering the animal. Because in the end, what did you really do to the animal? It makes sense, right? Because what does slaughtering mean? Slaughtering means you slaughtered an animal and now the animal's dead. What's the difference whether you can eat it or not eat it, right? Rabbi Shimon really has the unique approach. But basically, Rabbi Yochanan says, well, then the braita should have listed tavach umachal, right? Both cases and not just one. So comes Reish Lakish to retort back and says, okay, I'll go with you. And now I'm going to raise a problem according to you. Elamai, Rabbi Shimon, what you think, it's Rabbi Shimon. Well, kilayim b'tvicha ika b'mechira leikta. Okay, wait. If you're saying when it says selling the treifa, it means only selling and not slaughtering. Slaughtering, you'd be exempt, and that's your whole proof. Well, what about the kilayim case? Kilayim, it says only slaughtering. What? If you sold the kilayim animal, you wouldn't be liable? Of course you'd be liable. There's no difference in mixed breeds between slaughtering and selling. It would be all the same. So that's what he's saying. It makes no sense. And therefore, elatana tvicha, comes Reish Lakish and basically says, even though all the other braita don't really work this way, but you could have a unique approach, a unique braita that was written in a weird way. When it says tvicha by the kilayim, slaughtering, it means tvicha or mechira. So basically, you can read it like this, right? When it says ganav kilayim utvacha, it means and you slaughtered or sold. And when it says treifa and you sold it, it means you sold it or slaughtered it also. And that is the way Reish Lakish reads the Mishna, the braita, in order to make it work with his approach, which is, well, this is all the rabbis then, because you are liable for slaughtering the treifa. And then it would be the rabbis, and then it's not Rabbi Shimon, and then it is a case where ita b'tvicha and ita b'mechira. It is, you're liable for tvicha and you're liable for mechira. It doesn't contradict me at all. But Rabbi Yochanan comes back and says, Rabbi Yochanan amar lecha, hi mai. I don't understand what you're saying. Like, how does this really work? Rabbi Shimon. If you're going to say like me, Rabbi Shimon, then I have a good explanation for why kilayim only says slaughtering and not selling, or only one, not the other. Because I did tani treifa b'chada, tani kilayim b'chada. He says the following. This braita, for whatever reason, wanted to talk about these two cases. Now, the second case, because this is Rabbi Shimon, that's his whole approach, because it's Rabbi Shimon's approach, the shchita of a treifa wouldn't be liable, but selling you would be, because that's Rabbi Yochanan, those two things don't go hand in hand. So that case could only be in one particular situation. Which one is that? Selling. So since it said treifa in only one case of selling, when it talked about kilayim, it also only brought one case. And that's just to make it parallel in a literary structure. So tani kilayim bechada. That's why it said only one example of kilayim. But iyamart Rabbanan, if you want to say it like the Rab, now, even though that's not the most convincing, but this I think is really the more convincing answer. He says the following. The second part of his argument is a little stronger. Iyamart Rabbanan, if you think it's the rabbis, and both kilayim could be selling or slaughtering, and the treifa could be selling or slaughtering, narvinu v'nitninu. You should have, first of all, not separated them. They should be together as a list. And then it should say in both of them, right? It should say like this. Narvinu v'nitninu means put them together and then give the halach. It should have said ganav kilayim utreifa, right? If you stole an animal that was a mixed breed or it was a treifa, tvachan umecharan, and then you either slaughtered or stole them, mishalem tashlumei Bava Kamma. And then it would tell you, okay, the law in both those cases, and whether you slaughtered them or you stole them, should be you pay Bava Kamma. So the fact that it doesn't say that seems to really indicate that you're not liable for both, in which case I've proven it's Rabbi Shimon. And okay, you have a little bit of a difficulty against it because the kilayim one doesn't really make sense, but it was just to create a parallel structure. Now, why choose the opposite one is a good question. Why this one's slaughtering, that one's selling, a little strange, but okay, in fact, and then they end with kasha, and they say, in fact, this is difficult for Reish Lakish. Because Rabbi Yochanan, here it's an interesting kasha. If you really thought he knocked him out, you would use the word tiyufta. That's like a pretty much knockout word. Sometimes you could still answer tiyufta, but it's pretty much, this is the bottom line. This opinion is kind of knocked to the side. Kasha means we're left with a difficulty, meaning it's not clear cut whether they really reject Reish Lakish here, whether they accept his answer. It's a weak answer, but it is an answer. But Rabbi Yochanan does make more sense to say that it really means both. Sorry, that it really means for kilayim, it's both, but for treifa, it's only really one of them. Okay, again, each side has a bit of a weakness, but Rabbi Yochanan does come up a little bit ahead here. Now that so that really finishes our section right now on this whole thing about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish's answers to answer up how, now again, I'm just going to review this, and this is a good review of the daf, and then we'll just go off on this very last point, which is just an outgrowth, a tangent from the Mishna, from the kilayim, which really has nothing to do with our topic. So what we did was and this really, I want to just clarify how this all started, review it again. Rabbi Shimon on yesterday's daf, we didn't really understand what Rabbi Shimon and the Mishna was talking about. And we had to explain that Rabbi Shimon wasn't talking about the case that the Mishna was actually directly discussing, stole and then sanctified. It must be sanctified and stole, even though that's not what it says in the Mishna. So it was based on a suggestion of what Rabbi Shimon meant. And then they said, well, it's not that Rabbi Shimon contradicted himself, it's our interpretation of what Rabbi Shimon meant in our Mishnah contradicts something else Rabbi Shimon said. There's a big difference between saying Rabbi Shimon himself contradicts something he says somewhere else, or it's saying, well, our interpretation of Rabbi Shimon contradicts what Rabbi Shimon says somewhere else. It's not a question on Rabbi Shimon as much as it is a question on our interpretation of Rabbi Shimon on the Mishnah. And it's saying, we're not sure your interpretation really stands because it contradicts this other statement of Rabbi Shimon about shchita she'enu ru'iyah is in shchita, and then why would you be liable for tvicha, right, for slaughtering it? In which Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both gave answers, in which case we can stick with the line of saying that when Rabbi Shimon said, we're going to distinguish between chayab b'achriyut and not chayab b'achriyut, in the case where you are liable, we're going to say it's talking about where Ruth stole Naomi's sacrifice, and not that she sanctified it later. Ruth stole the sacrifice that Naomi had already designated as a sacrifice. So the theft happened after it was sanctified. And then, even though we said, but then it's not a proper shlita, we came up with cases why it could be a proper shlita. And then we just had to check all those options, right? We had to figure out how that works with other sugyas that we saw, and how that all fits in. And that's basically what we did today. And then we had to, if you want, we'll do a quick review, which is, well, first of all, we have Rabbi Elazar's question about, but it's not actually a shlita kshera because the blood spilled, because it wasn't redeemed. Well, since it could have been redeemed, since it could have been sprinkled, it could have worked. And therefore, it's as if it worked. Therefore, it is a shlita kshera. So that resolved the shlita kshera issue. And then we proved, where do we know that from? And then we had to go back to why doesn't each one hold like the other? And that got us off on this other machloka between them about treifa and mechira. In a case where you can't slaughter that animal or you can't sell that animal, will you be liable for doing the other action to it? So if you can't slaughter it, what if you sell it? If you can't sell it, what if you slaughter it? And that was Reish Lakish said, you're not going to be liable. And Rabbi Yochanan said, you are. And that was what motivated Reish Lakish not to hold like Rabbi Yochanan. So that was a good review of everything we learned today. Now we're just going to finish up by talking about this kilayim case. Now, the premise of the Mishnah is very simply, if you steal an animal that's a mixed breed, you're liable for, right, and you slaughter it, you're liable for the 4 or 5 payment. So now the Gemara wants to know, wait a minute, why are you liable for kilayim? What does it say in the Torah? It says shor oseh, right? You're going to be liable 5 for the shor and 4 for the seh. Kilayim, sektiv. Okay, so what that says seh in the pasuk? Well, amarava ze bana'av. We have a pasuk where seh appears. Okay, there's a debate. Tosfot brings Rashi's approach and Chulin on this, and them have their own approach about which pasuk. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's a pasuk from where we learn that there's a binyan av, that means it creates a paradigm. That kol makom shene'emar seh, anytime the Torah says seh, which means sheep, eino ela lahotzi et hakilayim. It comes to say we only mean pure breed, not a crossbreed. Okay, not a goat and a sheep. Okay, so now that's a question then. It says seh by our pasuk, and we already learned elsewhere. Okay, we'll talk about the 2 pasukim in a second, where we possibly learn it from. That whenever it says seh, it means kilayim are not included. So theoretically, you should be exempt if you sold kilayim from the 4 or 5 payment. So if you look in Tosfot, so the second line that Tosfot quotes me, dichtiv shor sek vasim v'seizim. What's the pasuk here? We're talking about kashrut laws. It talks about what animals are kosher. It says a shor, a bull, and a sek vasim and a seizim. Okay, seh seems to be, even though we usually say a sheep, but kvasim are sheep and izim are goats. So they say, the pasuk says there's a seh. It's a little bit more of a general term. There's a seh that's goats, and there's a seh that's sheep, and a seh that's goats. So they learn from this pasuk, this is a good proof pasuk. There's seh that's goats, and there's seh that's sheep. There's meaning you can't call it a seh and have it be a kosher animal if it's a crossbreed between the two. It has to be pure breeds. And then they say, well, then anytime it says seh, we're going to learn that. Now we say seh tamim. Okay, so now skip 2 lines down. That's what Rashi says in Chulin. And now Tosfot says, but I think it's a different pasuk, and it comes from the Korban Pesach. In Shemot Yubet, when we're commanded to bring the Korban Pesach, it says, seh tamim zachar ben shana yelachem. Okay, Tosfot quotes it, but it doesn't quote the important part of the pasuk, which is the end of that pasuk. They often do that because they just assume you know all the pasukim by heart. Min hakvasim umin aizim tikachu. So now it says either take it from the kvasim or take it from the izim. Either take it from the sheep or take it from the goats. But again, this teaches you not a mixture. So now we're basically talking about if you have an animal that was born from a mixed, right, 2 different types of animals, then generally we say you're not going, right? If it said seh, it means that's on the outs. So that would mean you're not liable. And here we said you are liable. Shane hacha, so here comes the answer. This is different. Okay, that sounds very simple. Instead of just saying seh in our pasuk, it says or seh. Because it says or, it could have just said shor v'seh. You would have known shor v'seh means shor or seh. So why does it say o? To teach you something additional, which means it comes to include kilayim. And this is a unique exception to the rule. That sounds great. We could have ended here. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? O comes lerabot, v'chol o lerabotu, v'ha-tanya. We're going to have an exact kind of pasuk that's almost the exact same thing. And the O there is going to include kilayim. And I'm sorry, it's going to exclude kilayim and not include kilayim. It's going to be the exact reverse. They're going to take an O and they're going to say it excludes kilayim. And we just said the O included kilayim. V'ha-tanya, shor o kesev. Okay, this is a pasuk that says shor o kesev o ez. When these animals are born, a bull, a sheep, or a goat, when they're born, they should be 7 days with their mother, and after that, they're ra'oi. You can bring them as a korban, as a sacrifice. Now, prat l'kilayim, the o kesev comes to teach you you can't bring a sacrifice from an animal that was born from a sheep and a goat, for example. No can do. O is, this is a very interesting halacha, prat l'nidme. If you have an animal, let's say born to 2 goats, but it looks more like a sheep, okay, sometimes genetically those things happen. It looks like a sheep, you can't bring it on the altar, okay? It's because something doesn't look right about it. In the temple in general, we're very interested in how things look. We've seen this in a whole bunch of sugyot. Anyway, that's a separate thing, but the O also comes to limit. So how can you say O by us is lirabod and O there is to limit? Seems very random and it doesn't seem to fit. We should have a principle. O either includes or O excludes. And even if maybe in some case it includes, but when it comes to kilayim, basically it's the exact same topic. And in one case we say it excludes kilayim, in the other case it says it includes. So Amarava, basic answer, hachamein yana dekra, v'hachamein yana dekra. It's all about context. How many times do we say this in our lives in general, right? It's all about the context of how you say it. Now, how does a drasha work? A drasha generally comes to distinguish it, to make it different from what the simple reading of the pasuk is. So if the pasuk seems to indicate something, then the drasha is going to come and indicate the opposite. So that's why we're going to go different ways with the O in each pasuk. So let's just go through. In our case, gabe geneva, by theft, dichtiv shor oseh, she'iyata yachol lahotzi kilayim mibenehem. Now, a shor and a seh, you can't mix them together. They don't mate. Okay, they won't mate. Now, why won't they mate? You could tell me from a why they don't mate, I don't know. Okay, from a real sense. Rashi explains they don't mate, and I don't know if this is true because I'm not a big animal expert, or to say the least, it's an understatement. But Rashi explains the following. If you look in the middle of the Rashi, the last Rashi on the page, according to the way the rabbis understood it, their months of gestation are different. The gestation period is different. The large animals, like the shor, it's a 9-month gestation period for the animals born. Okay, and a small animal is 5 months. So basically, because their gestation period is different, there's no way they can possibly mate. So that means when you read this pasuk, shor oseh, you assume this doesn't include kilayim because there is no discussion of kilayim. There's no option of kilayim. We're talking about 2 animals that can't mix. Oh, then comes the O. And now remember, the drasha is always going to go against what the simple reading of the pasuk is. The simple reading is there is no such thing as kilayim here because we're talking about either a shor or a seh. When you have this now added extra word, it must come to include kilayim, to say, well, even if there's kilayim, obviously the kilayim would be, a shor and an animal that could mate with a shor, or, a seh and an animal that could mate with a seh. And then it will be included. Gabe kodashim, but by kodshim, it's the opposite. What does it say there? Dichtiv kesev ve'ez. Now, kesev and ez are goats and sheep. They, right, kesev is sheep, ez is the goat. Those could go together. So since in the pasuk there, you already are thinking of kilayim, and you would have thought that kilayim are included, you could make kilayim olama'etu. So the O comes to say, no, don't think that. Okay, so it's interesting because you would have thought when you say in context, it would mean whatever the context was, that's what the drasha is coming to. But no, it's coming to go against, because the drasha, again, always says something that's not in the simple reading. So if the simple reading is one thing, the drasha comes to say the opposite. And that's why the O in each place could actually say the opposite. So all we did in this section really was prove why are kilayim included, that you are going to be liable for Bava Kamma, when it seems like generally kilayim in a lot of other places, right? At any time it says seh, usually it doesn't include kilayim, but in this case it does. And that's because of the O. What about the other O? Well, each one depending on the context. we're going to continue this discussion about the kilayim tomorrow, but we'll end here for today as our daf ends here, and we'll see everybody tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day and besarot tovot.